Welcome everyone. It's such a privilege to bookend a really exciting day of learning. I hope that you've still got some energy left for what I've got to give you. I'm going to roam around a lot. Is everyone okay? Can you still see me if I wander over here? Is everyone okay with that? And I'll probably wander over here as well. Just make sure, because I could stand on the podium far away from you, or I could get nice and close. Welcome to this session. It's reading comprehension, but not as you know it. And it's a little introduction into the why of a knowledge-rich curriculum. There's a little bit of how and there's a little bit of what, but I'm really trying to justify, I guess, why we should be paying attention to knowledge and potentially give you some context as to why it's been taken out of our purview as literacy teachers. So if you want the slides, get the slides. If you don't want to receive emails after you sign up for that, just unsubscribe to the first one you get, but feel free to download the slides and use them right now. If you want to stay in contact, you're more than welcome. That'll come back again. Oh, yeah, some people still going. It'll come back in a moment as well at the end. I'll give people another 10 seconds. Cool. So you don't have to photograph the slides if you don't want to, because you'll get the high res, so not high vis, something else, high res version that you can keep. So I want to acknowledge the work of Reed Smith, who's been really inspirational in his leadership and his thought leadership as well in this space. He's talked about a different topic today, but he's also an expert in this very thing that I'm about to talk about. Do check out OCA Education as well if you haven't looked at it. Also the work of Brad Newen and Docklands Primary School. I just came from a fantastic session with Dan Oliver, who's from Docklands, and they are really leading the space in this way as well at a primary school level. Brandon Park Primary, that they have been incredible in the work that I've done with them, and since leaving them, they're still trucking along beautifully. And Read to Learn, which is the product of their work at Brandon Park, is a really fantastic thing that I think we're contributing to the wider education space. And then obviously Core Knowledge is an incredible resource that you should have a look at as well. I'll be referencing them too. So what are we doing today? I want to tell you about where all the knowledge went, and that'll explain itself in a moment. I also want to talk about two major flaws in the Anglophone curricula. So Anglophone being English-speaking world, what are some major flaws that are maybe contributing to where this knowledge has gone and how it hasn't actually been a factor in when we've talked about reading comprehension. Then I'll talk about knowledge as a really powerful anchor for language and literacy and learning, and how it actually can build everything together and allow us to really develop the content of what we're trying to teach, not just the structure. And then look at knowledge as a social equalizer. I think for too long, knowledge has been put aside because it is hard and it's complicated and it's detailed. But when we ignore it, the kids who need it the most miss out the most. We'll delve into each of those topics now. So let's look at this one. So where is knowledge in reading comprehension? If we look at Scarborough's reading rope, it's right there at the top. So a lot of people, you go straight to the bottom strands and look at the phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. We know in our schools that if our students aren't reading and they aren't spelling proficiently at a basic level, they're never going to be able to access the text that we want them to be able to do and to write the text that we want them to. So a lot of our energy, if you're on a science of reading journey, a lot of your energy will go into those bottom strands. But there's a magic up in those top strands. And the top one is background knowledge, because as I'm about to show you, you can't understand the things that you read unless you have knowledge. Even knowledge that's tacit or sort of not accessible in terms of a conscious way, that knowledge is key to understanding all the text that we want our students to be able to read. So if we ignore it, we also ensure that the kids that don't have the knowledge will continue not having the knowledge. So have you ever tried to writing something that doesn't require any inferences? I have. Would you like to read my story? It's not going to be fun. Okay, I'll start reading it to you. Tell me what you think of this opening to my story. It's about a man getting ready for work, and it's a difficult read, I have to say. Not because the words are hard, and not because there's any inferences. I'll show you. Okay. At 6 a.m, which is early in the morning, most people are still sleeping. However, it is important to wake up this time because there are many things that need to be done in the day. So, John, the main character, did in fact wake at 6 a.m. He brushed his teeth for 2 minutes. One of the first things to do after waking is to brush your teeth. This order is common in North American countries, but teeth brushing usually occurs after breakfast in Australia. Is that the case? Or when people brush their teeth? Hands up for before breakfast? It's a very American sort of way. Yes, look, the Americans are putting their hands up. And after breakfast? Yeah, that makes more sense, right? But in American stories, or if you've seen movies, they often do teeth and then they go down and have breakfast. Like, ugh, like, anyway, bit of knowledge there. I didn't want to leave that out, so I ensured I put that into the story, right? There's a reason for that. Okay, so brushing teeth involves using a toothbrush, in case you didn't know, and toothpaste to clean your teeth and freshen your breath. After brushing your teeth, it's important to have a shower. This is what John did next for 15 minutes. Showering means standing under a stream of water to clean your body and wash off any dirt or sweat. It is important to shower to stay clean and fresh. And the story continues, but it's exactly like this, and it's kind of painful. Hands up if you found that interesting to read. Right? Hands up if you found it enjoyable. Okay, but if you were an actual reader, like humorous because it's so ridiculous, right? Okay, good. You're on the same page as me. It continues, so you can read that if you want. There's more. This is just the opening of the story. I'm not going to make you read it now. But how annoying is it to have to read writing that assumes no knowledge? It's annoying. It's painful. So knowledge is what we use to make those inferences. So we know about toothbrushing. We know about how to go and have breakfast. We know about 6 a.m. being early. You don't need to explain that. But if students don't have a piece of knowledge that is implied or is needing to be inferred, then they're not going to understand the text. So that what I'm about to show you, which is a version of that story with lots of knowledge implied and a lot of inferring needing to happen, some students won't be able to access it. I want to see what you think of this piece of writing. John stirred awake at the crack of dawn as the dimly lit room started to glow with the morning sun. After peeling himself off the bed, he stumbled into the bathroom and grabbed his toothbrush. 2 minutes later, he was in the shower with steam clouding the room. As the water cascaded down his body, John's mind started racing. What kind of day would it be? Hands up if you think that's a better piece of writing. Yeah. And someone tell me, why is it better? What's better about it? Same information, not new information, not different. Thank you.
It conjures mental images.
Yes. So by excluding all of that extraneous information that the reader should know, you're evoking other things. So we're thinking about how he's getting out of bed. We're thinking about what's he thinking. We're learning about the imagery, as you've said, of what it looks like in the room. We get a sense of how he's going into the bathroom and grabbing your toothbrush is different to he then went and brushed his teeth. There's a sense of you can imagine him doing it. But imagine if you didn't know the word stumbled in this one, or if you didn't know peeling himself off the bed. You're not literally peeling him off. It's an imagery, or it's a metaphorical use of the word peel that gives an image of him going, oh, and getting out of the bed like that. And stirring awake. He's not being stirred. So if you had to explain that and say stirring, not in the sense of literally stirring, but in the sense of waking yourself up or arousing yourself out of sleep, you can see how if you tried to do this kind of vocab with that level of explanation in the previous text, it would be impossible and also not very enjoyable. So that story continues. If you want to find out what happens to John, it's in the slides. But essentially, writers leave spaces for inferences. They have to. Otherwise, the writing is impossible to read. But if you don't have that knowledge, you cannot make the inference. Reading comprehension assessments attempt, and I put this in italics, to avoid requisite knowledge. On the NAPLAN test and in the American equivalents and UK, they try and choose topics that aren't the topics that they're studying in school, which is really weird, right? But because they're trying to control for that knowledge effect, they know that when students know more, they can read better, and we'll delve into that further. Vocabulary is intrinsically tied to knowledge. You can't separate the two. For many years as a speech pathologist, before I retrained as a teacher, I would try and do explicit vocabulary instruction and pull the vocab from wherever. And it's working in the sense of they learnt the words, but did the words stick after a few weeks or after a month or after years? Probably not. Because it has to be tied to something meaningful, and knowledge is how we can tie things together. The other way you can tie things together, which we'll touch on, is stories. So when things are attached to stories, they also hold together really well. So you can't actually teach reading comprehension without tapping into vocabulary and without tapping into knowledge. Who's heard of the baseball study? Put your hands up. Okay, I've got about 30%. Let's do a quick crash course. I'm going to do it in 3 statements. Are you ready? Or 3 parts of one statement. Poor readers who know more understand and remember more. So even poor readers who have been assessed and said you're not a great reader, you don't do well on reading comprehension assessments, when you give them a test on something they know about, in this study it was a baseball game, and they separated them into groups who knew a lot about baseball and some who knew nothing about baseball. And these poor readers who know more actually understand and remember more than great readers who know less. So in this study, the best results are the kids who are great readers who know a lot about baseball. The second best are kids who are really poor readers but know a lot about baseball, who outperform the great readers who know nothing about baseball. So knowledge is actually a facilitator of reading and can remove the effect of just being a bit of a poor comprehender in general. So if they know stuff, they can understand better and they can have a better reading experience. So good readers know things. There's one of the things they do. We also know with the Scarborough's reading rope, they have to be great at decoding. They have to be great at other aspects of language, grammatical structures. But they also know things, words, but also concepts. So if that's important, how do we actually teach knowledge? How do we teach it to our students? It's not just about activating. For years, the balanced literacy view has said, it's all about activating prior knowledge. That's one of the strategies you can use. But what if they don't have the knowledge? There's nothing to activate. So you actually have to build knowledge. And Natalie Wexler uses this Velcro metaphor. We're saying that the more knowledge you have, it's really like Velcro. You've got more things that you can stick new knowledge to. So students who know more will then be able to learn more from what they read, from what they hear. When you know less, it just comes off you like Teflon. So it slips away. Like you hear a great fact, I didn't understand it, gone. Or you might understand it for a moment, but if it doesn't have something to connect it to, like a schema, then you lose it as well. You forget about it because it was like, that was something to do with, I lost it, it's gone. But if you know something about it, and you know a lot about it, that topic or that text becomes really easy because your brain focuses on the new things, not on all of the potential things, which is why that text about John getting out of the shower was so painful to read because it's like, I know how breakfast works. I know how showers work. Like, you're distracting me with all this information. What's the actual action? So there's two major flaws in the way that the whole curriculum has been put forward in the last 30 or 40 years in English-speaking countries. The first one is the fact that we have an outcome-based curriculum, which has removed knowledge from its focus. There isn't a focus on what are the concepts, what are the topics, what are the ideas that we want students to know. That's been removed. What's been replaced are verbs, outcomes. Let's go into that first. So let's look at year 3. Can you read with me so I get you activated a little bit? Here we go. So year 3, start with the word discuss, and off we go. Discuss how an author uses language and illustrations to portray characters and settings in texts, and explore how the settings and events influence the mood of the narrative. Is there any knowledge in that descriptor? No. So that could be about anything. That text that you choose or those texts that you do could be about anything. And in some balanced literacy classrooms, we've been encouraged to change the topic every single day. Or the teacher might be modelling with one topic, the students go off and practice the same strategy with a completely different topic because it's about the level they're up to, not the concept that you're building. And so as a result, the knowledge is just like, it's like a thing that you're not even thinking about in the background. And if it's not at the foreground, then the kinds of students who don't have that knowledge will never get that knowledge. They won't necessarily be able to progress with their reading comprehension because they just don't know enough to be able to make those inferences that are so important. Let's look at year 5. Oh, here's my favourite one. Here we go. Read with me. Use comprehension strategies such as visualising, predicting, connecting, summarising, monitoring and questioning to build literal and inferred meaning to evaluate information and ideas. Way to pack in a lot in one descriptor, hey? They were told to reduce the number of descriptors, so they put them all in, like they've crammed them all into one. This could be like 7 descriptors. But are there many nouns in this descriptor? Are there many things that you're learning about? Nothing, really. It's all the verbs. So you want them to visualise stuff. You want to predict them, connect stuff, summarise stuff, monitor stuff. They're all verbs. But if you haven't actually looked at your what you're teaching and how you're building understandings and knowledge, then your students might not be remembering very much. The classic example of this is a student I tutored for a few years in the time that I was training as a teacher. And I would ask him every day what he did. So I saw him once a week. And how was school today? What did you do in literacy? What did you do in reading? And he'd say, on various occasions, he'd say, we did inferring today. I was like, okay, that's cool. Inferring's important. What did you infer about? And he was like, I don't know. He could not tell me the topic. He could not tell me what he read about. He knew that he was meant to be inferring, and he could give me a really rough definition of what inferring was, because that's the explicit part of the lesson, but he couldn't actually remember what he read. And so if he can't remember it, he either didn't understand it, or he understood it for such a short amount of time that it didn't stick. So without knowledge, the kid's spending all this time practicing reading strategies, but nothing's staying in there. Like, it's a really concerning thing. And it's not our fault, because this is what's happened in the whole curriculum movement has said that knowledge isn't important. We're going to be agnostic about knowledge. What is important is the outcomes. So we want them visualizing, monitoring, expressing. And it doesn't matter what the text is. And what I'm trying to get across to you today is it does matter what the text is. And it matters what we choose and how we order it, how we align it, and how we help knowledge build over time. Because you can't build knowledgeable groups of students from one session. It's something that builds over lesson, over week, over year, over the whole time of their schooling. So that when they come across a text and they see something that's vaguely connected to what they've sensed before, they have enough knowledge, enough vocabulary to be able to attack it and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to make an informed guess here and think that word means this, because I know that this is something to do with polar bears, which is an example I keep going back to. I'm not sure why in other talks. But they might have heard something, oh, there's polar ice caps. Oh, okay, we're talking about that. I've learned about polar bears before. They live in the polar ice caps, okay, the North Pole. And then they're going to make a more informed decision about the diet of that kind of species that also lives in the polar regions. So, but if students don't have knowledge to sort of hang to, it means that they never get an opportunity to develop real reading comprehension skills. Because we're thinking that reading comprehension is a knowledge agnostic activity when it's really not. Okay. So there's too many verbs, there's not enough nouns. There's also a real limit to the way that we've structured the humanities curriculum, history and geography and civics, in that it uses something called the expanding horizons approach. Hands up if you've heard of that before. Reed Smith's putting up his hand. Well, of course he has. Not many. This is something that's like, it's like the water we swim in. Like you wouldn't even know what it's called. It's just so natural. So here we go. It's something like this. Foundation Year 1 students should do all the stuff about the home and the school. Year 2 and 3, it's all about the suburb and the town that you live in. Year 3 and 4, it's about the state and maybe the country. Year 5 and 6, you might start looking at the region, so Indonesia and New Zealand. Then year 7 onwards, you might start thinking about the world. So it's this expanding horizon approach that starts from the very smallest unit of closeness to where you are and then builds up to the top. So you might be doing like lessons in foundation or year 1 on community and talking about what a community is and what's our community. And this is from a Read to Learn unit. I've adapted this definition. And there's nothing wrong with this definition. But if our approach is that students never start learning about big concepts like the world, like continents, like world geography, like river systems, like mountains, if they never get to that until year 6 or year 7, some kids are just always going to be held back by that lack of understanding. And I've worked with kids in youth justice in my original PhD research who could not tell me the difference between a continent and a country, who could not find Australia on a map, who didn't have a concept of when the ancient world was and how long ago it was and what the modern world is and how different it is. And the classic example I use from my wife's teaching career, which was for about 3 years before she left the profession, which is such a shame. And had I known what I know now, I might have been able to convince her to stay. It was a while back that she left. And she, choir-based learning, year 7, students going off and doing a project about ancient Rome. Some kids are going off and doing well. The kids that have more privilege, the kids that have more background knowledge, they're going off and researching something that's actually of value. Other kids potentially spending a lesson and a half searching Roman cars, because that's to do with Rome. No concept of ancient, no concept of ancient Rome. There was no cars. It's completely obvious to someone who has that knowledge. But if they didn't have the knowledge, they don't have the knowledge. Another classic one, same unit. Students spending times after learning some explicit teaching from my wife about aqueducts and the importance of sanitation, went off and Googled aqua, ducks. So ducks that are to do with water, even though all ducks are to do with water. And that's the disconnect between, that's obviously a phonological and an orthographic challenge there as well, hearing something and not knowing how it's different in the spelling and all of that. But also not knowing anything from year 7, never hearing of ancient Rome, never hearing of ancient world or the ancient times, or that there has been this world history sort of thing. And that's, I think, partly to blame is the expanding horizon approach that's embedded within our curricula. So there's a great paper on this. This is just one of many. This is a nice accessible one. So I've got the link down the bottom. This is a freely accessible article. It really tries to problematize the issue with the expanding horizons approach. The basic argument is small kids can handle big ideas. In some ways, bigger ideas are easier to understand than small ones. So navigating your local area is more complicated than learning about 7 continents. Much easier to learn about the 7 continents. And when you hold students back from learning about the world or learning about ancient history for 6 or 7 years, you potentially create really big misconceptions. You know, teaching about Australian history before they have any concept of at least an introduction to ancient history. I think it does create a lot of misconceptions around the time scales and the chronology. And where Australia is in the world and how the events that led up to colonisation. Because in the primary school curriculum, there's a big focus on colonisation and a big focus on contact with Aboriginal peoples. But if they don't know about ancient civilisations and I guess how those evolved and how they changed, and also what led to the European expansion across the New World and then to the southern continents like Australia, then you're not going to really understand that properly. Because there's big concepts there that are easier to then understand the really complicated concepts, which is to do with the contact with white people and Indigenous peoples and all the terrible but interesting things that also happened as well. So in year 1, the core knowledge sequence, which we've used to develop some of our read to learn units, they teach Mesopotamia, year 1. Ancient Mesopotamia, one of the first civilizations that emerged. And this second lesson in the series is called Farming Changes Everything. And the learning goal is I'll explain how farming changed the way people lived. So it's about Mesopotamia. We're using that as a context. We're actually learning about some big things, like how farming changes a society. So this is a text they might read. Let's read it together. Just activate our audience participation. Here we go. Read with me. Long, long ago, people moved from place to place, gathering plants and hunting animals for food. Pause. Gathering is a verb. It means looking for, picking and collecting plants to eat. So a bit of in context, in knowledge, vocab teaching. We'll come back to that term later. So that's what gathering means. Continue from sometimes. Sometimes they lived in simple huts. Over time, people learned to farm. Pause. What's farm mean, everyone? Let's have a look. Farm is a verb. It means planting seeds to grow the plants needed for food. Who's heard of farming before? My year 1 students, pretend. Or, has anyone visited a farm before? Have you been on an excursion? Yeah, remember we went to that farm last year? So farms are really important because they change society. Let's finish it off. We're up to slowly. No, we're up to they grew. Thank you. They grew plants that could be eaten as food. Slowly, groups of people began to live together. Get better at reading there, Nate. All right. Turn and talk to your partner, that's what this means. Answer this question. Long, long ago, how did people first get the food to eat? Use this sentence frame with your partner. Go. And 3, 2, 1. I say knock, knock. You say who's there? Knock, knock. Who's there? Very good. Erin, can you give us your answer?
Uber Eats.
No, okay, full, and this is EDI principles. Full sentence answers is what I'm asking for. So use the sentence frame, Erin.
Hold on, I can't read it. Long, long ago, people got food to eat by farming.
Excellent. So this is a hinge point question for this slide. If I don't have a good sample of students who have told me that they understand that farming... I'm getting confused. What I wanted you to say there was actually by hunting and gathering. Yeah. But this is a good point. I would actually go back at this point and I would reteach. So thanks for demonstrating a non-example of a question. I would need to go back and be like, okay, I've got Erin over here who doesn't quite get it. I'm going to go back. Because previous to this lesson, we've got a lesson on ancient. So we've got ancient versus recent. And we established the concept of things that are ancient and recent. So long, long ago refers to ancient things and things of recent. And so that's the precursor lesson. And then I use these CFU questions to basically make sure my students are getting me. So I'm not lecturing at them. I'm not making them read a whole lot of things and just memorize it. There's a constant interaction between what I'm doing and what the teacher's doing, according to explicit instruction. So students are able to respond to show what they understand, but also to participate really, really frequently. So thanks for that demonstration of that, Erin. Beautiful. So there are limits to this approach then, because I can tell you these Year 1 students were really excited about Mesopotamia, and they really understood it, because old things are actually easier to understand sometimes than recent things. The modern world is a really complicated place. When you strip things back and think about what would it be like if we didn't have farming? How do we get our food? There are some logical things that students can hypothesize and then link to the knowledge that you're building in units like this to then make a reasonable map of what society would be like. And then they have an exploration in this unit about what happens when farming is existed. How do people start living together? If people start living together, they can start building buildings. If they have buildings, then who's going to decide who builds what? So you need a sense of governance and laws. It also about this time, 5,000 years ago, that writing was invented because they needed to create records of who owed what to whom, sort of economic reasons, and also writing down laws for the first time. So Reed will know the ancient guy who wrote down his king, I'm going to mispronounce its name. Say it again? Hammurabi. Is that how you say it? So I haven't taught this unit recently. So Hammurabi was a king who wrote down his laws and was the first examples of a constitution of a society written down. So, there's ways that you can then build in really interesting concepts, but done in a really age-appropriate way. So it's actually easier to do this than it is to say, we're going to do like 5 weeks or 10 weeks on like what is in your home and where is your school. Because if you think about it, the kids who need us the most to explain these big concepts don't need to spend lots of time understanding their home environment. Like there's going to be opportunities to do that. There's well-being, there's other ways that you can build that in. And there's also in this unit a lot of connections to the home environment, but through the lens of the ancient world. So we look at how they lived and then we talk about how we live now. So those connections are still there. We're just not saying that, ancient things are too hard for them to understand, so we're going to push it away. All right. So knowledge then is really an anchor for learning and for literacy. So that example of the vocabulary that I had on the slides before, it's a way of anchoring those new concepts and new words to something they're going to remember. So when you start talking about ancient Mesopotamia, there's going to be like a firing of different experiences and knowledge and videos and things that you've explored with them that are then going to have words and concepts attached to them. Words that are going to actually stay with them forever because you've built it in such a knowledge-rich and interesting way. So what about comprehension strategies? Do we just not teach them? What are we going to do with them? We're used to creating our curriculum around which strategy are we teaching this term and next term and so on. My argument is that you can do a stripped back version of comprehension strategies. You don't have to do every single one. There's like 6 or 7 or 10, depending on how many you look at. But you can do some ones around prediction. You can do things around comprehension monitoring, so checking that it makes sense, going back if it doesn't. And obviously summarising, which main idea summarising, is there really a difference between finding the main idea and summarising? Maybe not really. Summary is just a longer way of finding the main idea, right? So those 3 things can actually be done in an embedded way. So I'm going to model as a reader in a whole class reading situation, like on these read to learn units, and show you how I'm going to summarise. I'm going to show you how I'm going to check if it makes sense. Erin just said that long ago they learned they got food by farming. Let's go back to the test and see if that's right. And we'll go back and we'll check that, make sure that we understood the text correctly. We also do it in a modelled way. So the teacher models it, but the students are getting an opportunity to summarise, to make predictions, through the process of doing those check for understandings together, using mini whiteboards, which Dave Morkunis, who's left, but has said that you can take his mini whiteboards from his cold, dead hands. That's how much he values them in his classroom. He also said today he could teach in the desert with a group of kids as long as he had his mini whiteboards. That's all he needs. So that mini whiteboards are really handy for this as well, to see their understanding and see their knowledge, but all of the CFU questions as well. So I'm arguing here that we don't probably need to teach comprehension strategies that much in a separate lesson, let alone separate lessons for 7 years, which is at the moment sort of how it happens. The research around comprehension strategies, if you haven't looked at it, most intervention studies last 6 weeks. That's it. The benefit of teaching comprehension strategies by themselves as a thing doesn't show any benefit after 6 weeks. There's no studies that show how useful it is to do it every single year. So that's a real con of the balanced literacy movement, in that it's this is how you teach reading. And I would argue that it's part of it, but it doesn't have to be the focus. If you've seen my other talks, like inverting the balanced literacy playbook, comprehension strategies at the moment are put at the front of the lesson, and knowledge is, like I said before, is at the back. We don't care about the knowledge. What I'm asking you to do is not get rid of comprehension strategies, but to just move them to the background. So I'm going to teach you a lesson about this unit of work, of knowledge, or we're going to do a literature study, and we're going to look at a particular book and really understand that story together. And there's going to be language and knowledge at the forefront. Comprehension strategies are still there, they're just in the background. Because if you're constantly asking them to be like, remember what predicting is, remember what hypothesizing is, remember what main idea is, like you're actually distracting away from them getting the most out of that text and really enjoying the text together as well. So, example of how this might look from the Vikings. See what, I've got like 3 minutes left, so I'll just see what I can do. So I just wanted to show you this example as a year 3 one. So here is another one where we've got great vocabulary, things like rugged, fertile, and fjord. I wouldn't be able to get my students to remember these words if I didn't wrap it up within a knowledge-rich unit like this. And I can tell you when this is the first knowledge-rich unit we trialled at Brandon Park, and I put it together based on core knowledge, the kids couldn't get enough of it. We had kids telling us, literally, I love reading now. Because they didn't like it before. They didn't like the reading groups. They didn't like being drilled in comprehension strategies, especially those really reluctant boy sort of readers. It's just a stereotype, but there's a lot of boys who are a bit reluctant and don't love it. They love this. They love really rich and interesting topics and hearing about the ancient world. And obviously, this still relates back to the immediate world. We're constantly drawing analogies, but this you can really sink your teeth into. And as teachers, we love teaching this. Like if you jump into one of these units, like you get so much out of it. And your kids actually go off and they inquire and come back and tell you about it. I'm just going to go through that. So my point there is that you can't really teach knowledge in a vacuum. That example from before where I tried to teach words without having something to hang them onto, it doesn't really work. When you have a good story or when you have a good knowledge unit where you're really wrapping up the understandings in something that's meaningful, that's when the vocabulary is really going to stick. And that's when the knowledge and the reading comprehension strategies are really going to shine. So you can't teach reading strategies in a vacuum, in my opinion, on the basis of the research. So the knowledge-rich units and narrative texts are really strong anchor points for retention. That's what really keeps those nuggets of information in the students' brains, which is what we want for them to become great readers. And lastly, to sort of round out discussion, is that knowledge is a social equalizer. When you have knowledge-rich units, you're able to level the playing field of students that you have in your care. Some students will come to you with all of this incredible knowledge because they've gone on a world tour and they've done all these amazing things, and they go to the museum every weekend or they go to the zoo, and they're just fully loaded with all this amazing facts already. And you've got students who don't have a lot of knowledge. They have knowledge about their immediate experience, which might be quite deprived in terms of educational opportunities. So knowledge and teaching knowledge really well actually gives them the boost that they need to reach their peers. So ask yourself, like, what do my students know about X? And really think, well, what do I want them to know about it? Because I'm not just going to assume that what they're bringing is everything I want them to know. So what do they know about rivers, for example? Here's a bit of a session on rivers. You could do an inquiry-based project and say, everyone go off and research your favourite river and try and make sense of it. And that's the approach in a lot of humanities classrooms today, is to go off and do that. Or you could learn about some really cool rivers based on, these are linked, so this is the Nile and the Yellow rivers, which link to an ancient Egypt unit in year 1 and an ancient China unit in year 2. So they're linking to previous knowledge units that they've built, and they know already something about the Nile and Yellow rivers. Now we're using that as a context to learn about rivers in general. So this is the Nile River, the longest river in the world, and it's the most important river in Egypt, and we're learning all about how rivers work. And I'll just go like that because it's going to distract you for a moment. There we go. So we're not going to go into that unit just now. It's in your slides if you want to. But my point here is that instead of getting students to go and find out themselves about what they know, because we know that the students who already have knowledge will be able to do that really well, but the students that don't have knowledge will end up searching Roman cars or aqueducts. And that's a problem, because we want them to have really rich experiences, that you can actually build your inquiry in a different order. So I'll tell you a bit about the Matthew effect first. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. This applies to decoding, but it also applies to knowledge, probably more so to knowledge. So the students that know more will learn more every single day of school. The students who know less will actually learn less because they've got no Velcro to stick anything to. But there's also the Peter effect. If you yourself as a teacher don't put knowledge at the forefront of your own learning, you're not going to be able to pass on that knowledge to students. I cannot give what I do not have. So unless you also have an opportunity to delve into these amazing areas of the curriculum that aren't in the Australian curriculum, they go much further than what the Australian curriculum says to do, then you're not going to be able to teach those amazing nuggets that your kids really need you to teach them. So Shane Pearson and I like to say this. It could be based on someone else's quote and we've just synthesised it somehow, but if so, I'd love to be corrected. But we like to say students should inquire from a place of knowledge, not from a place of ignorance. When you inquire without any background knowledge, you inquire about pretty mundane, mediocre things. But when you've got background knowledge, knowledge is what we think with. So it makes you a better thinker. And it also means that creativity and that critical thinking that we want all students to do links back to that knowledge. It's domain specific, as Tanya introduced today at the start. So this is what you can do when students have a rivers unit and then go off and do an inquiry about rivers. They create their own river system and they use their knowledge to make really interesting annotated examples of what they know about rivers. And some of them were saying wouldn't it be nice if we had an estuary here? Because that's just a really cool feature that I learnt about. And we need to construct a mountain because all rivers start at mountains and they end in the sea. So then we need to create the sea. Rather than going off and inquiring and making some pretty dodgy misconceptions or bits of information that don't really speak to the core of what rivers actually are about. So let's review. Knowledge is really vital, but it's missing from reading comprehension a lot of the time. There's really those two major flaws in the curriculum. Let's see if you remember them. The first one was, yes, it's outcomes-based. Thanks for reminding me. It's outcomes-based. It's not about the nouns. And that's a real problem because we haven't specified what we're going to teach, just like the stuff that they're going to do with that knowledge. We haven't specified what that knowledge is. And the second flaw is expanding horizon curriculum. May it be condemned. What we really need, and I can't flick back right now, but what we really need is an approach that builds from the bottom, from our experience upwards, and comes down from the top. So we are in the world, we're on this, there's these continents, this is our continent, this is a general feel for that sort of stuff, same as history. This is ancient history, this is recent history, and then eventually the two will meet in the middle. And that's how you build those rich connections, because big ideas aren't necessarily harder to understand, sometimes they're easier. Knowledge is really an anchor for learning and literacy, and it's underutilised. So in terms of memory and cognitive load, when you know stuff, you're going to remember the new stuff that's related to that so much better. And knowledge is a social equalizer. Nothing will bring your students up into feeling more confident with their reading and more interested in actually going and reading stuff. Because we've had kids say that, I want to go and read about this now, because they're so enlivened by the knowledge-rich curriculum that we've started. It's a social equalizer, because kids that hate reading or kids that can't do it or don't like it, this gives them a boost to say, well, this is what you could use your reading for. Like, you don't have to read about anything. You could read about really interesting stuff, and now you know something about it, you might realise just how interesting it is. Another challenge is what knowledge is worth teaching. And that's something that is really hard to decide. And for the last 30 years, we've essentially said, we can't decide that. It's too political. We can't say what to teach and what not to teach. And so as a result, knowledge has been left out. But I think, can we avoid these decisions any longer? Not if we want all of our students to become proficient readers and writers and thinkers. So, teaching knowledge as part of reading comprehension is a real game changer. From the research, but we've seen it in our practice as well. Our national and our state curricula are not always conducive to the teaching of knowledge. It's just not there. So you have to learn to operate within and beyond the curriculum. Stephen Capp likes to say, from Bentley West, that our curriculum is so broad that you can drive a truck through it. So if you can just tick off those outcomes that you have to tick off and know that you can go much further with much more interesting, much more delicious content for your students to do, then that's the goal. And know that knowledge-rich curricula actually bring all students to the reading table. It opens up the world of reading in a way that's really fascinating and really beautiful. Have a little read of those things. The slides are available, as I said. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you.